invite us in, and I hope that anyone is local and is around, wants to just come and check it out and drink the Myco products. Myco Love, thank you. We do offer that product here as well, and he's a supporter of ours. We're a supporter of him, and this community is really great. And I know you already know that, so I'm grateful that you're all here today, and we can build on that. So, do you want to say anything?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for being here. It's a delight to host things like this at the space. This is kind of exactly what I envisioned the space to be for, is to just really allow the the Myco community to have a venue to do events. And we are going to be remodeling soon. This wall's coming down. There's going to be a new wall where that curtain is further back, so this place is going to have more versatility for events, live music, spoken word, stand-up comedy, you name it. If there's an event, workshops, classes, talks, all the above. Myco Love Farm is our exclusive producer of the mushroom infusions we use in the drinks here. So super impressed with the quality of the company, great stuff. So this space back here is available for anybody to use for free. If any of you have a workshop, a class, want to teach people how to cultivate, want to teach people how to identify mushrooms, want to teach this or that, just want to have a meditation circle, a yoga class, wherever. The space is free for anybody to use, so just find out how to contact us, and it's all yours. This is a community space, so you all are welcome to it. And without further ado, I hope you guys enjoy the talk.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm going to send it off to him. Yeah. I'm going to go monitor my dog because I will get arrested in this town. And I shall be back. Please enjoy yourself.
Thanks. Yeah.
I'll see you.
We're gonna run about an hour, and then hopefully Shane will be here.
Yeah, he's on his way. He's 5 minutes out.
Okay, well, hey guys, I'm Gordon, otherwise known as Fascinated by Fungi, now, which is weird because I used to be, beer guy or scuba guy or always some kind of guy, and now I'm just a mushroom guy, and it's a different iteration of being a different kind of guy. This was the first art piece I commissioned, and I've done a bunch of different logos and stuff now with different small independent artists, but this is still one of my favorites. Is a guy named it's Chris Oxley, or Oxley Art on Instagram. And he had a bunch of, these are Arcambolo faces, kind of a classic thing of doing a face made out of still life, out of fruit and stuff, they make faces. Chris had done them out of whales. He's a marine biology student. So I reached out to him and was like, dude, I love the way that you use color, and your watercolor is amazing. And I was like, do you think you could do them with mushrooms? And he's like, maybe, but I don't know anything about mushrooms. Could you kind of tell me what to do? And I was like, sure. So I sat down and I kind of thought about it, and I was like, well, I needed an animated head, maybe some blue mycena eyes, and just kind of pointed out. I did a very poor sketch, but Chris turned my absolutely poor sketch into a beautiful mushroom thing. He also asked me to send him a picture of myself, so I sent him sort of a 3/4 view of me holding a maitake, and that is what that is. So people have called it nightmarish. I don't entirely disagree, but I also kind of love it. So that's that. I would love to stand up here and give you the whole talk, but unfortunately I don't have a little clicker thing, so I'm going to sit back in the corner. What is?
I can talk for you.
Yeah, I want to sit back.
Okay.
Earlier I was eating some mushroom toast. I managed to get mushroom toast all over my shirt, so now we have a casualty of those delicious cordyceps. I got a lot of slides, and I don't know what pace I'm going to go through them, so we'll come back up and answer questions. So if you want to look at my ugly mug, you can see more of it. All right, so Fascinated by Fungi. It's on every conceivable platform at this point. I started on Instagram. I went to TikTok. Do you think you could move slightly to the left? Just scoot your chair over. Just kind of bit. And same. You guys can move slightly to the right. Just yeah. Sorry, I was just worried about the path. Perfect. Okay. So I started on Instagram, then started at TikTok, and that's when things really got off the rails, because Instagram was kind of nice. So I was like, 10,000 followers, and yay, that's fun. And then TikTok started, and I got into the millions, and stuff got really weird and funky. I'm also on Facebook and YouTube and Pinterest and Patreon and iNaturalist and Spotify and all these different things. And this sort of all started, I went to UC Santa Cruz, banana slugs, go slugs, for college. Went to UC Davis for a PhD. There was all this cool food science stuff going on. Ended up finishing my PhD, and I went and worked at Opus One, which is a very sort of fancy winery in Napa, and I figured I should get some actual winemaking experience, since I'd done a biochemistry degree, but it's sort of a very applied winemaking type stuff. From Opus One, I ended up going and working in selling and supplying Bay Area biotech companies, places like Impossible Foods, with all sorts of probes and mixers and tanks, and I got a lot of sort of functional biotech experience. And behind all of that, I was sort of always been interested in mushrooms, but it was a latent thing that I hadn't really thought about in a long time since I was a kid. But I lived in New Zealand for a little while, Napier, which is a little bit like Monterey of New Zealand. And it was a typhoon season, so there's mushrooms everywhere, and I started taking photos, and I got really inspired by these two sort of gateway mushrooms I found in New Zealand, which were Colostomy parasitica and Favolotia calocera. This is a big sort of piapini-like mushroom that grows on wood. There's nothing else in New Zealand that looks like it, so it was a good one to find. Like, all right, I'm gonna found it a few times. I'm gonna try eating it. Ate it, didn't die. Decided to eat more. Kind of got a bug to go out and hunt more and find more edible mushrooms. And then at the same time, my mom had gifted me this tiny little like clip-on macro lens for my iPhone. And there's these little orange, they're called orange pork conch fungus all over New Zealand, growing on every piece of deadwood. And I took this beautiful photo of it, and this is like literally the first thing I posted on Instagram. If you go all the way back in my 1,000-something posts, you'll see that this is the first one. And I just thought the texture was amazing. And in reading about it, I was like, wow, this is actually an invasive mushroom. This is from South Africa, and it's displacing a lot of the endemic wood decay fungi of New Zealand. So encapsulated in one thing was a bunch of my interests that suddenly like kind of ignited, where I was like, wow, here's something totally beautiful that I needed a little macro lens to really capture the detail, and it turns out the ecology of it is sort of fascinating and has this much larger impact than this tiny little orange mushroom. So those are some things that really like got me rolling again, and I started the IG and then snowballed into TikTok and YouTube and all this other stuff. Everything I've done has been self-taught. I don't have a degree in mycology. I've never taken a mycology class. I don't know anything from anyone else. I use tools like iNaturalist and other online resources. There was no one single book that taught me everything. Again, I just Googled stuff, basically. And so when people ask me like, well, what book do I need? What class do I need to take? I'm like, you don't. You can literally just start doing it. That being said, I received a lot of guidance from the community. I am very lucky to have made friends on Instagram. I have joined mycology clubs. I have gone to events, and all of that has contributed massively to the knowledge I have. Currently across platforms, I got about 2.5 million, which is pretty insane. It's a lot. Most of it is TikTok as opposed to everything else, but you know, so it goes. And I'm just really grateful to teach people about mushrooms. And it's a very international audience too. I think a lot of people who get big on social media end up getting big in like an English-speaking country because that's the language they're communicating in. But I see a lot of impact for my stuff in Southeast Asia, in South America, especially the videos that don't actually have words or talking and tend to be a little bit more visceral with me touching mushrooms in interesting ways. Which if you've seen my account, you know what I'm talking about. So, we're gonna start this. I'm gonna warn you guys, this is gonna be a little sciencey. But I'm gonna try to make it as fun and digestible as possible. And a little bit of this stuff is what I wish I'd known when I first got into mushrooms, and no one really ever explained this to me. So, fungi are everywhere. All mushrooms are fungi, but not all fungi are mushrooms. So that's just the first thing to put out there. And I'm gonna talk about them somewhat interchangeably, but I will, about halfway through the talk, switch to specifically addressing mushrooms rather than fungi as a whole. Right now we're going to be talking about fungi as a whole. So they are everywhere. They're in the soil, which everyone thinks about. They are also in the water, which people don't think about. And their spores are in the air all the time, everywhere. And they interact with pretty much every form of life, from bacteria to plants to animals to algae to little protist swimmy things. And they do pretty much everything in an ecosystem. They're on us, they're in soil, they're parasites on algae and frogs and all sorts of stuff. So, when I say everywhere, I also mean absolutely everywhere. They are in, volcanoes. They are on the deep sea floor. They are in deserts. They are in these really extreme environments that we don't normally attribute fungi to being there. Granted, I'm not talking about mushrooms. I'm talking about fungi, and this includes like little microscopic things and lichens, but they're everywhere. And a lot of people, you may have heard the phrase like mushrooms can save the world. And I bristle when I hear that, because I'm like, mushrooms already are our world, or like fungi are the world. We live in a fungal world, and the world as it exists only is this way because of the impact and the guiding silent hand of fungi that has kind of like driven evolution and antagonized everything to be the way that it is now. So the role of fungi in nature is often to sort of set the plate for other organisms. So fungi are part of the base of this is a soil food web, but this is somewhat similar for an aquatic food web as well. That fungi are things that help to generate conditions where other organisms will be able to grow, and at higher and higher levels, trophic levels, things are benefiting from the role that fungi play, and they really do decomposition. So in general, fungi are cycling complex carbon, whereas bacteria tend to cycle nitrogen. And that's one of those sort of basic divisions to keep in mind. So people always talk about like fungi decomposing dead bodies, and that's not really true. There's not very many fungi that actually deal with decomposition of a body because it's too much protein and fat. There's a few, but not many. Mostly they're concerned with breaking down plant matter, organic stuff that's not as animal-based. So if we zoom out, is there any chance someone could close that door so we don't have quite so much noise from the cafe? It's wonderful, but I don't really want to hear the blender. Thank you. And this is a good one to pause on for a second too, because this is a big figure and there's some cool stuff on here. So there's 3 domains of life: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. These are both tiny little microscopic things you can't see. You guys know bacteria. Archaea tend to be sort of associated with extremophiles, extreme environments. Turns out they're everywhere, though. They're just almost as common as bacteria. We just didn't catalog them as well. And the advent of eukarya came basically from a archaea swallowing a bacteria and inventing larger, more complex cells, which then kind of spun out of control and created animals, fungi, plants, slime molds. Here's a breakdown of eukarya. There's kind of the fungi right there. There's slime molds are in there with the amoebas. And here's this really cool fungal tree of life. And it starts down here with these little microscopic swimmy things, which we don't really think of as fungi, but they are part of the evolutionary lineage. And it goes up to recognizable mushrooms like this stuff over here. It branches off into ascos, and I'll talk about these different types in a second, but this is like the cordyceps and the truffles and some of the other weird stuff. So the evolution of fungi and mushrooms tracks with the evolution of everything else on Earth. There is no extraterrestrial origin of fungi as much as people really want that to be true. We have absolutely no evidence for it. And in fact, there's a really good genetic evidence based on looking at the DNA for where fungi came from. So there's this, what's called the last universal common ancestor. And then bacteria split off, and then there was this other sort of last eukaryotic ancestor. And from there, plants diverged maybe 1.5, 1.7 billion. Animals and fungi diverged about, let's say, 1 billion years ago. And you hear this all the time, that animals and fungi are like humans and mushrooms are more similar to each other. We might need to scoot that. Yeah, sorry, the projector's not ideal.
Smoothie?
Smoothie? Hi. You got a smoothie? Perfect. So yeah, you hear all the time, and this is an oft-repeated thing you hear in the world of science communication, that people are like, mushrooms and humans are more closely related than they are to plants. You're like, yes, that is technically true because of this like evolutionary divide, but there was still 1 billion years worth of evolution between fungi and animals, so they're not that similar. They are similar in some ways, but there are big differences. And then specifically, mushrooms emerged about 100 to 200 million years ago. Because mushrooms are mushrooms, they don't fossilize very well, right? They're not bones. And they don't get stuck in swamps quite the same way. So we don't have as good of a fossil record for the development of mushrooms. The oldest fossil we have is about 120 million years, and then the oldest one that's like really clearly a mushroom is this thing that's preserved in amber. It's about 100 million years old. And in theory, some of the first mushrooms to evolve were like little crusty things kind of grew on wood. But they made the transition from land, or from water to land, like most other forms of life. So here are sort of the 4 basic categories of fungi where they slot into. There's the chytrids and chytrid-like ones that are kind of aquatic, so they have spores that swim around. Then fungi made the transition to land. They lost their flagella, the little tails. And then we got zygomycetes fungi, which are sort of the first ones to start evolving. And here's a breakdown of like this evolutionary trajectory. So there's a lot of these kind of chytrid things. They've diversified. They're still around. There's a lot of gray area in this zygomycetes thing, because there's a fairly small portion of what survived, but there's a lot of probably evolutionary dead ends that didn't quite happen, so there's all this unknown space. And then we have ascomycetes that have little spores with sacs, and basidiomycetes that have little kind of club things where their spores are on them.
And when you look at the diversification of fungi over time, a lot of it happened in periods where there was big environmental disturbances. Think like an asteroid killing 80 to 90% of life on Earth. So there was a lot of dead stuff around, and the fungi were like, oh, sweet, food. We're going to do this. So that's what they did. So I'm going to say that there are 4 basic categories, and then I'm also going to tell you that fungal taxonomy is really complicated, and we can get into the weeds very deep. I'm not going to go into it beyond to say, there's 4 types. Great, that's all you need to know. You don't need to know the 20 plus different taxa. And really what it slots into is most of them are ascomycetes. About half of that is basidiomycetes, and then there's a bunch of these other little tiny clades of things that are, a lot of them are swimmy ones or things that are microscopic in soil. You're gonna see like they're parsed out between soil, endophytes which live inside plants, in the air, marine, freshwater. These big brown ones in freshwater and marine are the chytrids, so they're the ones that kind of swim around. They like aquatic habitats, so they're common in those. But there's also, what I want to point out is that even in marine environments, there's a lot of fungi that digest stuff in marine environments and are important both as parasites and saprotrophs, which decay things. So I'm going to run through the 4 basic types and just kind of give you some facts on those. These are chytrids, and again, these are little microscopic swimmy things. They live in water, aquatic environments usually, and they can parasitize algae, small plankton. They can also function as little saprotrophs and live in the bottom of the sea floor. Deep sea and freshwater, both very common. And the most famous chytrid is something that's actually killed about half of the amphibians on Earth. It's a disease that is just wrecking shop on frogs and salamanders and all this stuff. And it's probably been spread around by human influence of humans trading illegally frogs and other amphibians as part of the pet trade. And there's slowly some emergence, some resistance that is emerging. And so we're seeing some populations bounce back, but a lot of frog populations, a lot of amphibians have just been absolutely floored by this small microscopic parasite that we don't even really think about. They spend a lot of their time living as sort of a single copy of their genome, which is called a haploid, or their anamorphic form. And they can grow in a bunch of different ways, but one of the kind of classic ones is they'll infect a cell and then grow rhizoids into it. These are sort of like mycelium, not quite, it's like early prehistoric mycelium, but they're using that to kind of suck nutrients and create the same kind of interface they do with other stuff. And then they'll release their spores from an organism, a little bit like a virus bursting out of a cell. They have different lifestyles. I still have a lot to learn about chytrids. They're cool though, they're pretty interesting. Then we have these zygomycetes fungi. So ones you guys might have heard of would be like rhizopus, which is black bread mold. If you've got mold on bread, it's rhizopus. If you've ever had tempeh, they use rhizopus to make tempeh. Pilobus is one that's any piece of poop probably has some of this stuff on it. And these little things that grow up, and then it's called hat thrower fungus because that little black dot, it grows up, and then this part swells until it bursts and it projects the black dot away from the poop, so that the fungus is not in the zone of deadness around the poop because it's too much nitrogen. So it needs to get somewhere where it's not, doesn't have so much nitrogen. And then the other kind of really famous kind of zygomycetes is the glomeromycota, which form mycorrhizae. These aren't the mycorrhizae that make mushrooms, but they are far more common all across the earth. Most zygomycetes fungi spend most of their lives as haploids, and then they'll form this kind of weird zygospore, which is this like one big giant spore. And they don't, like I said, they don't form mushrooms. They do infect insects as little entomopathogens, kind of like a cordyceps, but a lot of them are just microscopic, but they have much larger influences than we often recognize or really give them credit for, and I think that's kind of cool. So it's just another one of these 4 types of fungi to keep in mind. Then we have the ascomycetes, and this is where we get into the mushroom-forming fungi, so you can finally care about these because at least they make food, right? I came at mushrooms as a belly hunter, as Michael would call it. I was interested because I could eat them, and then I realized there was so much other cool stuff going on that I just had to continue paying attention. But they make mushrooms, weird ones though, like morels, Silaria, cordyceps, truffles. Most lichens are ascomycetes, like 98% of them. Molds, like penicillium, which is where we get the antibiotic from. It's also what's on the outside of your brie, your blue cheese. Saccharomyces cerevisiae is the yeast that makes alcohol for humans, and it has, for good and bad, driven a lot of human development and behavior over the years. Most ascomycetes also spend the majority of their life form in an anamorphic haploid state, and it's only when their mycelium joins and they become dikaryotic, and then they pretty much immediately go into mating, and they are very shortly become a diploid, and they produce spores and start all over again. There's sort of two basic spore dispersal types for ascomycetes. You have flask versus cup. A cup fungi would be like the little holes in a morel is like a cup, and so it's lined with these little asci, these kind of needle-shaped things, and if you blow into it, you can often see spores come out of it. And then the parathecium is more like a little sort of flask that lives inside of something, and then the spores will come out of this little tip hole. So if you actually look at a cordyceps, there's lots of little dots on a cordyceps, and this is the dot you see on the top of a cordyceps, and the spores are sort of on the inside like that. And we have basidiomycetes, and this is all of the recognizable mushrooms we know: a classic Amanita muscaria, a polypore, a jelly fungi, a hedgehog mushroom, chanterelles. Those are all basidiomycetes. But they also form some molds. They form plant pathogens like smuts, sweet lacoche, rusts like the juniper apple rust, which is a really crazy looking orange thing. Rusts have crazy like multi-cyclic lifestyles where they switch between different plants, and they have all these different asexual sexual stages. And then there's a very small number of lichens, but there are basidiolichens, and instead of forming little cup-like things, they form things that look kind of like mushrooms. And basidiomycetes spend most of their life in a teleomorphic form, i.e. they are dikaryotic or diploid. They have at least two copies of the genome, and then they'll form, so the mycelium is usually dikaryotic, and then they mate and form spores, and that gets dispersed from the mushroom, and they start all over again. And just to really drive home like the diversity here of basidiomycetes, here's a great figure that kind of tracks the evolution of basidiomycetes. So some of the early basidios were like jelly fungi, like a witch's butter, chanterelles, jelly wood ear kind of thing, little earth stars, and then it radiates out into rustlas and boletes and polypores and waxy caps and oyster mushrooms and shiitakes and entelomas, pink gills, amanitas, lycoperdons, and everything from this point on developed like dark spores, which are a lot more energetically costly to produce, but they survive a lot longer in the environment. So sort of white spores, these things all had white spores, and it's sort of guessed that like maybe early on white spores were the most sort of primitive type of spore. Most ascomycetes have white spores, but these basidiomycetes have developed some really like complex, highly ornamented, long-lasting spores that can persist a long time in the environment. And I don't know, a figure like this just makes me kind of like go boggly-eyed. I'm like, whoa, look at all that. It's cool to think about evolution and how it's driven over the last 100 million years, and how all these mushrooms have come to be. So we're going to go a little bit into the ecology. So there's sort of like three basic modes. You have like a symbiotroph or a mutualistic fungi, which is growing mutualistically with something. You have a saprotroph, which is digesting dead stuff. And you have sort of parasitic pathogen fungi. All of these, technically, at least the symbiotroph and the pathogen, are technically parasites. Everything that's parasitic just means you're growing with something else. You can have both a mutual parasite versus like a pathogenic parasite. So saprotrophic is decay. That's fairly simple. Parasites were probably like the original mode of fungi. Everything was parasitic, and so anything that is working with fungi in a mutualistic way was really just a parasite that antagonized each other for long enough they suddenly became friends, and they're working together, even though it was originally just parasitism. But parasites can be either a biotroph, where the host stays alive, or a necrotroph, where the host dies. There are entomopathogens, where they infect and grow on insects. There are mycoparasites, where they infect other fungi. And there's mycorrhizal, where they mutualistic with plants. You guys have probably all heard of that kind of thing. But technically, a mycorrhizal fungi is actually a biotroph. It's a parasite that is mutualistic. You have endophytes, which live on the inside of plants and are sort of part of the plant microbiome. Like our guts are full of bacteria. Plants are full of fungi and bacteria that are endophytes. You have epiphytes, which are fungi that live on the leaf surface. Lichenized fungi that have created these sort of big mixed communities of fungi and algae and other microbes in there. Nematophagous carnivorous fungi that eat worms in the soil. Aquatic parasitoids like the chytrids. And fungi can be mutualistic, but really they're opportunistic, and they're always able to kind of shift from being like mutualistic and symbiotic to being pathogenic if it suits them. And that's a good thing to remember, because fungi are just opportunists. They're out for their own, like most forms of life, but they can go from being something that is like helping you to suddenly hurting you if temperature changes or nutrient conditions change, or even the other amount of bacteria change, right? We get yeast infections. normally those candida yeasts are actually helpful to our system. But if we get a pH change or something else, hormonal changes, boom, yeast infection. So just, keep that in mind. Okay, so the decayers, the saprotrophic, saprobic, don't say saprophytic because that infers that mushrooms are plants, which they are not. Fungi are separate from plants. So we trying to help people remember the saprotrophic or saprobic are both correct. Saprophytic, not okay. So this is sort of in an order of which, like, say a tree dies, the first thing to grow would be endophytic fungi like xylaria that are already inside the plant, so they've got first crack at the available sugars in the wood. And then quick growing environmental molds like trichoderma or rhizopus would be on the spot to just eat up all the available sugar that's there. Then you have sort of a predictable cascade of stuff that happens either with white rot fungi or brown rot fungi, and those are coming in to digest all the complex carbohydrates bound up in either the cellulose or like the lignin. So cellulose are like long parallel fibers that run and create the structure of plants, and lignin is a big complex molecule that cross-links all those fibers and gives wood a lot of structure. And so lignin is a very hard molecule to break down, and for a long time fungi didn't have the capacity to break down lignin, and that's ideally where all the coal in the world came from this like 400 million year period where they couldn't break down trees until white rot fungi evolved the enzymes to break down lignin. So there's these two different types. Brown rot tends to prefer conifers and warmer areas and consumes mostly the cellulose, hemicellulose, and leaves wood with this kind of cube-like texture. Examples would be like a Dyer's polypore. Chicken of the woods is also brown rot fungi. White rot fungi are stuff like Ganoderma, oyster mushrooms, wine caps are all common ones. And those prefer hardwoods and cool areas and eat a lot of the lignin and leave wood this kind of like shredded texture. And once these have been through the wood, you have sort of composted soil. And then we have our classic like button mushrooms in a garrick like this. You'll see these growing in fields too, field meadow mushrooms kind of thing. And stuff like a shaggy ink cap that likes really well decomposed substrates. So this is nutrient-rich substrate and soil and leaves the soil really rich and full of life kind of thing. But it accomplishes this whole cascade of breaking wood down from this like indigestible thing to just soil. That's what fungi do, and they do this in aquatic ecosystems too. It's not quite as well defined between like brown rot and white rot, and there's other kinds of decomposers that fit into this whole thing. It takes a village to go from dead tree to soil, but fungi are the ones to really make it happen. Okay, so here's a few different forms of fungal parasitism. There's like a reishi mushroom or a Ganoderma. This technically would be like a biotroph because it doesn't always kill the host. It can live on a tree for many years, whereas a honey mushroom is a very pathogenic, plant parasite that goes in there and kills the tree. These are some examples of mycoparasites. So Hypomyces lactiflorum, which turns a boring russula mushroom into this beautiful red thing that is, a better edible in general. This is an ascomycete, and like if you look at a lobster mushroom, all those tiny little dots are the parathecium. So it's also technically a flask fungi, and it's cool because it turns like a gilled mushroom into a spore production factory for this ascomycete mold. There's shrimp of the woods, which is actually a combination of entoloma and honey mushrooms kind of battling out to create these weird fungal galls, which are pretty tasty, actually. I don't think we get them out here, but they do occur, in Midwest and East Coast. Here's two examples of entomopathogenic fungi. That's a mouthful. Anyhow, so it's just Cordyceps militaris. This is similar to what we were eating at the farm today. And then there's a Gibellula, which this one specifically parasitizes arthropods and spiders. There's another picture, here of the rust and the corn smut. So these are more plant pathogens. Just love those things. Anyone here ever eaten wheat lacoche, corn smut?
Yes.
Yeah, it's pretty good, right? It's kind of funky looking. It's like a black food. There's not that many black foods. In fact, many of the only like black foods that I can think of that are really good are all fungus. Truffles, wheat lacoche. There's a few more of them. Squid ink too, but they all black foods kind of taste interestingly the same. And I feel like, and fungus is definitely one of the best sources of them. So carnivorous fungi, these are the nematophagous fungi, and so oyster mushrooms and wine caps are both examples of things that catch and trap nematodes, and this is to increase the nitrogen content because wood is not a great source of nitrogen. So they create, you see these little rings, but there's a whole variety of different structures that fungi will create to trap nematodes. They can also produce toxins. They can infect the eggs of nematodes, and they can even have little spores that break off and then penetrate and infect the nematodes that crawl around and then help grow new mycelium in new areas. So they can actually use nematodes to spread their own mycelium as another way of reproducing asexually, which is pretty wild. So there's a lot of emerging research on this. There's also a lot of idea of potentially using these kinds of mushrooms in agriculture that are able to kill nematodes, because nematodes are a big agricultural pest. And so if you could add mushrooms to your soil, to your garden, and then take down the pest pressure of the nematodes in the soil, sounds like a win-win. So here's some examples of mutualism. So lichen is a big composite community of all the fungi and the algae. I'll talk about them in a sec. We have fungi in our gut, on our skin. Our skin is covered in this yeast Malassezia, which is what causes dandruff if it overgrows, or tinea versicolor, kind of like the lightening of the skin. But most of the time it's benign and is probably good for us in some way by outcompeting other stuff. I said we have candida. It's in our GI tract. It's on our genitals. It's usually there to kind of be a bouncer and keep other stuff out, but it can also become pathogenic if things shift. We have endophytic fungi here that are like inside plants in different ways. Here's some great examples like termites and leafcutter ants, which are using fungus to digest the plant material and then consuming like the mycelium as food. And that's a huge number of these giant leafcutter ant colonies all over South America, into Central America. And these termite colonies are massive all over Africa, Southeast Asia. They produce some of the biggest mushrooms in the world, called termitomyces, which are just amazing and apparently great edible mushrooms. So I'm hoping we can figure out how to cultivate those here at some point. So here's some different forms of different mycorrhizae. The two most important for you to pay attention to would be the ectomycorrhizal and arbuscular mycorrhizae. That makes up most of the different kinds of mycorrhizae on Earth. There's also these ericoid mycorrhizae, which are common in sort of swampy, low nutrient areas and at high elevations, and they particularly associate with the Ericaceae, so like blueberry, cranberry family. There's orchid mycorrhizae too, and orchids basically can't fruit unless they find a fungus to draw nutrients from. I will mention this quickly, but don't worry about it too much. There's a really cool new paper put out by Toby Kears, who's a mycelium researcher, and they were doing like global estimates for how much carbon is sunk into the soil every year by mycorrhizal fungi, and it's a CO2 drawdown. And basically what they estimated was that something like, I think it's like 3.5 gigatons of carbon are sunk into soil every year by ectomycorrhizal plants. Or I guess it's like, that's total is 3.5, and then like the ectomycorrhizal is like 2.4, and arbuscular is like 1 gigaton, and then the ericoid contributes very small amounts. But like, these are bringing a lot of CO2 out of our atmosphere and putting it back into our soil. And if we think about global warming and the need to get rid of carbon, we have a very efficient machine to do that. We just need to stop cutting down all of our trees, which seems like a fairly simple solution, but we continue to log areas and kill old growth forests, which is deeply frustrating. So apparently some people don't understand that. This is complicated too. Arbuscular mycorrhizae are mostly all the Zygomyces fungi. It's about 80% of plants on Earth have an arbuscular or AMF association. Counts for about 55% of the vegetation on the planet. Tend to be associated with warmer areas, really nutrient-rich soils, grasslands, agriculture, not as many trees, and they don't produce mushrooms, just lots of cool spores in the soil. And then the ectomycorrhizal ones are both ascos and basidios, and about 1% to 2% of plants actually form ectomycorrhizal associations. So it's not very common, but it does associate with about 25% of the vegetation on Earth, which speaks to how large the big boreal temperate forests are in like Russia, Siberia, Canada, stuff like that. And they tend to prefer cooler areas and nutrient-poor soils and associate there with forests. And the lignification, the digestion of lignin is a big part of these ECM forests. Some of these ECM fungi will go out and forage for nitrogen so they can stretch very far away, whereas the AMF fungi tend to stay very close to the roots of their host plant. And there's there's what they call like a economy to this, in that these relationships are ultimately parasitic. So they're antagonistic, parasitic, and they become mutualistic over time. But if the plant has everything it needs, all the nitrogen, all the phosphorus, it no longer needs its mycorrhizal partner, and it will kick it out, because ultimately the mycorrhizae is drawing stuff out of the plant. So if the mycorrhizae isn't giving a benefit back to the plant's like, screw you, I don't need you. And that happens in agriculture because we dump a bunch of inorganic nitrogen and phosphorus on fields, and then we lose the fungal spores, the fungal diversity, and then we get desertification, and the soil goes away because there's not the mycelium there keeping it all kind of glued down. So it's an important thing to think about is these types of interactions between plants and fungi. And one of the things I would point out too is there's a lot of talk about, you know, the mycorrhizal network and sharing of nutrients between stuff. There's not that much evidence for it, and there's a paper that came out recently where a woman kind of absolutely took an axe to what we know about mycorrhizal fungi and said, hey, there's a lot of like positive associations we have with this, but we don't have any data to support it. So maybe there's a lot more competition going on between plants and mycelium, and this actual economy of nitrogen and phosphorus and plant associations is really what's happening underground. So like the concept mycelium is like the internet may be misleading and might be a little bit too much of a simplification for the incredible complexity that's happening down in the soil, especially we consider like, wow, a tree could both have AMF and ECM associations, and there's probably 10 to 12 different species of ECM even associated with one particular tree. So it gets complicated, and I'll leave it at that. Endophytes are these fungi that actually live inside of plants, like the microbiome of the plant, and they can help to induce resistance to pathogens. They can actually parasitize a pathogen, might be trying to hurt its host plant. They can create sort of an immune response, and they can even outcompete a pathogen. But endophytes aren't always helpful. They can also hurt a plant. They can become parasitic on the plant, just like the candida in our system can shift to being pathogenic. And you see this all the time. If you look at a leaf that's dropped off a tree and it has little like spots on the leaf, that's often the endophyte went from being like a mutualistic endophyte and producing secondary metabolites to help deter predation to suddenly trying to like prey on the tree. And the tree's like, well, screw you, I'm going to drop this leaf. It kicks out a bad tenant. Endophytes are tenants in the tree that is a building. So lichenized fungi are basically where fungi are providing the structure, and it's kind of like a coral in the sense that the fungal part is also living, and then the residents are these algae and cyanobacteria that are doing photosynthesis to produce sugars. But there's also a bunch of other yeasts, fungi, and bacteria in there that are sort of doing the metabolic translation there between the algae and the fungus. And it turns out that lichens are way more complicated than we have ever really thought. There's over 20,000 species of things that can be lichenized, because again, there's a lot of ascomycetes, there's some basidiomycetes. They associate both with algae and cyanobacteria. Some can even do both. The ones that have both tend to be associated with like more extreme environments, and they're probably hedging their bets by having both types of photosynthetic, what are called photobionts inside of them. And then there's a whole different community of things that are within this matrix that makes up a lichen. Mutualists, commensalists, and there's tardigrades and nematodes and other tiny animals that all live in there, and they produce a fantastic variety of secondary metabolites and amazing like drug discovery compounds. They even sent lichens into space and left them there for 3 months and then put them back in water, and they came right back to life. We can't do that. So lichen are also pretty darn cool. So here's this just incredible complexity of fungal behaviors. They can facilitate communication between plants and potentially in a limited way facilitate trading of resources between plants. That's been demonstrated in like forests that are all the same tree type. That has not been demonstrated in a normal forest that has a lot of tree diversity. And so take the idea of sort of nutrient sharing out of your head and be a little skeptical of that concept when you see the sort of beautiful illustrations and photos of it. It may not be as simple as you think. They can sense light. We saw that today at the farm. I got to see all the cordyceps they grow. They grow under these high intensity like pink lights because they grow a lot faster. So they get photoreceptors. They can go out and search and forage for nutrients, send out specialized types of mycelium to go long distances and search for nitrogen. They can manipulate and kill other organisms like cordyceps do to ants and other insects. They can sense touch and recognize like what is themselves versus non-self. So again, if you think about mycelium and soil, they may run into each other and form like a barrier, a competition thing where there's a chemical warfare going on between those two sets of mycelium, and they're pumping out secondary metabolites to kind of fight their neighbors. It's not all hunky-dory down in the soil. There's long distance communication. The largest organism in the world is this 3.5 mile diameter patch of Armillaria honey mushroom mycelium up in Oregon. I visited it. It doesn't look like much. It's just a giant piece of forest. And within the thing, all the trees are smaller because they've all been killed. And on the edge are larger trees that are being killed as this thing pans out. But how does something that's 3.5 miles wide communicate? We don't know. There's some theory that maybe there's electric signals being sent, but I'm very skeptical of that because there's actually no evidence for it. The idea that I kind of like instead is that there's like sort of pneumatic tubing that, like, you know, in a building when you put one of those things that goes and sucks it up to the mailroom up to the 4th floor or whatever. Fungi and mycelium kind of have something that looks a little bit like that. So maybe there's like specialized hyphal mycelium tubes that run long distances and allow them to kind of send messages back and forth across long distances and through little nodes. They can sense touch and all the chemical cues in their environment. They feed by breaking down organic matter, recycling stuff, and they reproduce by spores. So there's just this incredible variety of fungal behaviors that they do. And now I'm going to sort of switch from talking about fungi as a general thing to really specifically addressing mushrooms and what mushrooms do. So thinking about mushrooms, we have some kind of classic like basidiomycete things. We have gills, pores, ridges, teeth. If you guys have been out foraging, you hopefully recognize these basic forms as a way to look at mushrooms. When we think about mushrooms, we can think about like what's above ground, what's below ground. Truffles are sort of below ground. Ascomycete truffles, the classic like tuber melanosporums like black truffle, but there's a lot of basidiomycetes that have like a truffle form. Everything in the mushroom world eventually evolves into a truffle because it's a good lifestyle to like live underground and stink, so animals have to come dig you up. All the ascomycetes, we talked about cup and flask, but morels, cup fungi, earth tongues, cordyceps, all sorts of little things. We get to the basidiomycetes, we have the gastromycetes or gastroid fungi where the spores are on the inside. That's a puffball, it's a bird's nest, earth star, stinkhorns. We have things that are on wood like polypores, crust fungi, jelly fungi, corals, tooth, club fungi, the kind of cool looking, you know, Romaria, things like that. We found some Artemyces yesterday on our hike. Little tooth fungi like a hydnellum or a hawkswing, a sarcodon. And then there's boletes, mushrooms with little pores, and then mushrooms with gills. So this is sort of covering the broad diversity of mushrooms. And on my book that I'm working on right now, I'm trying to come up with a slightly better system, or at least sort of a core set of some of these morphologies you guys can work to recognize. Talked about earlier, fungi grow everywhere, but mushrooms really do grow everywhere. You find them on the ground, you find them on wood, you find them on other mushrooms. Those are powder caps, Asterophora. I found some of those up in Humboldt last weekend. You got cordyceps. This more common in like tropical, subtropical areas than they are here. We do have a couple cordyceps in different areas, but they're not well categorized. My friend Damon Tai took this photo down in Ecuador. It's really amazing, super cool. Tropical climates, you have lots of little like cup fungi and cool ascos, xylaria. Desert climates, there's a thing called a Tephrozeria or something. It's a desert truffle. It's like the size of a potato. It doesn't taste like a truffle as we think, but apparently it's sweet, nutty when you cook it up, and someone in Israel is trying to figure out how to cultivate it. You got cold climate mushrooms, little like enoki. Late fall oysters that come out even when there's snow. Even there's a mushroom that grows underwater. It's called Satharella aquatica, and it's really the only like basidiomycete mushroom they found that can fruit underwater. And the original specimen was isolated up at the Rogue River in Oregon, and they thought, well, okay, maybe it's this one special little habitat this thing occurs in. And then a guy in the LA Mycology Club this year, there's a lot of rain that happened in California, found one of these in LA. And they're like, wow, we just extended the range of this species by like 1,000 miles south. So maybe it's more common than we thought. We just didn't know. Incredible ways that mushrooms can grow. You guys may have seen a fairy ring at some point. This is not a portal to another dimension. It just means that there's a big patch of mycelium in the soil and mushrooms are fruiting around the edge. So they're spreading their spores. And sometimes you'll even see like in the center of a fairy ring will be really rich verdant grass because the mycelium has kind of decomposed and left all the nitrogen there. You'll see gravitropism. So mushrooms will always orient towards the ground to drop their spores down. And so this is a log that got turned over and then all the new growth is now orienting downwards. So you see that. Rose combing. Chanterelles, hedgehogs do this a lot. You'll find gills like growing on the top. So they're not orienting towards the ground. You're like, why is this growing gills upside down? I don't know. We don't entirely understand this phenomenon, but it's something to do with like moisture, nitrogen, maybe heavy metal contamination, other things like that. You can have incredibly tiny mushrooms. You can also have incredibly large mushrooms. This is one called Macrocide titans. And this is not a doctored photoshopped photo. This is real. These are absolutely massive mushrooms. They found this down in, I think, Mexico or Central America. They're huge. They're cool. You can find these in Florida too. You can have double-decker mushrooms. Again, sort of similar to rose combing. It's just growing a whole other mushroom out of a mushroom. That's pretty neat. Sclerotia is like a hardened black storage thing that mushrooms do. Instead of fruiting, they might form a sclerotia. Morels form sclerotia, and then the next year when conditions come permissible again, they'll fruit from a sclerotia and create more morels. Does anyone know what this black knob on the tree is? Chaga, yes. So chaga is not a mushroom. It is, in fact, a sclerotia. And here's rhizomorphs. So these are like specialized, weaponized mycelium that's all filled with melanin. Sclerotia also has a lot of melanin. The same thing we have in our skin to protect from sun and other forms of damage. But these are what honey mushrooms use to creep up in between the bark of a tree and the wood and girdle the tree and then kill and eat the tree. Not all rhizomorphs are weaponized like that, but these are, that's what they look like, a honey mushroom one. They have a lot of interesting ways to spread their spores. So you can be stinky like a stinkhorn. You can stink like a truffle, have an animal come dig you up. You can just be delicious and have a slug come eat you. And there's a lot of mushrooms, their spores won't even germinate unless they've been through like the digestive system of an animal. So in fact, eating mushrooms is a way that they've evolved to spread their spores. And I think one of our problems is we're not poop enough in the woods. If you eat a lot of mushrooms, consider pooping in the woods. Actually, don't do that because our poop is way too high in nitrogen. But animals eating mushrooms is a big part of their strategy to spread spores. You can have kind of mechanical things. This is what's called a cannonball fungus. Any homeowner with wood chips may be familiar with these because they're a nuisance and they will just absolutely ruin the siding on your house. But it starts out in a little thing and it kind of like essentially bursts a bubble. It builds up a huge amount of like calcium oxalate and then shoots this little spore-laden cannonball like up to like 20 feet away, which is the equivalent of like a human picking up a table and flinging it like 2 miles in the air. Like it's just an absurd amount of force that it makes. You have like a little earth star here, so raindrops hit this thing and spores poof out the top, same as a puffball. You can have like splash cups, bird's nest fungi, where the raindrops are displacing these little peridioles, these eggs, and throwing them around and spreading the spores that way. And there's ink caps. Michael was talking about these on our forum yesterday, that to spread their spores, they do what's called deliquescence, or they deliquesce, which literally means they melt. And so this mushroom is just auto-digesting itself into goop. And like that was filmed over about 22 hours, maybe 17 hours, something like that. But it's just like melting away into goop. That's not running super well, but you get the idea. You can use that goop as like a vegan squid ink, or you can mix it with alcohol and turn it into a ink that you can like paint and do calligraphy with, which I think is pretty cool. So, sorry, I should move the next slide. Okay. So here's some top tier edibles. These are all from California, but you get a lot of these out here too. Chanterelle, so that's the Cantharellus californicus that Michael, and actually this might even be a picture from the day that Michael and I were out. There's a King Bolete porcini. We get Gran Edulis instead of rubriceps, the way you guys do. Hedgehogs, hydnum mushrooms, black trumpets, Craterellus calicornicopedes is the species we have in California. Lion's mane, chicken of the woods, which I hear you don't get that much of out here. I get stupid amounts of it in Napa. If you ever want to come get some, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. When you go down to any eucalyptus grove, you'll find it all over the place. Oops. Cauliflower mushrooms, Spiraceus was one of my absolute favorites. Makes an incredible like gluten-free pasta substitute. And of course morels, and sort of two main types are like the blacks and the blondes. Anything that's a gray morel is classified as a black. Blonde morels are a little bit different. Poisonous mushrooms. So Amanita muscaria is kind of your classic poisonous mushroom, but honestly it gets a bad rap. It is both edible, toxic, and entheogenic or psychedelic trippy all at the same time. You can prep it to be a good edible mushroom, you can prep it to be more entheogenic, or you could eat it raw and just be really sick. I don't recommend that. But it rarely if ever kills anyone. You'd have to eat a lot of it to actually put yourself in danger. You're just gonna get really bad GI upset. These other three on the top, though, however, are absolutely very deadly. They all contain what are called amatoxins. They're little cyclic peptides that bind to a protein in your liver and shut down all liver function, and you die slowly over like a 9 to 12 day period. So I do not recommend messing around with amanitas unless you know what you're doing, because you have the toxic ochreata, this destroying angel, and the death cap. And the death cap is spreading invasively all over the place. Funeral bells are less likely you'd ever eat one of these because gallerinas are just little orange things that grow on wood. But if you're hunting for magic mushrooms and you don't know what you're doing, you might make a mistake. So always look for the dark purple spore print and bluing on a psychedelic mushroom, whereas these will have like an orangey brown spore print and will not stain blue. Don't get overly excited, I guess is what I'm cautioning you. Roll rims, people used to eat these, but apparently they can cause like some weird blood allergy and just like a horrible immune reaction, which can kill you, so don't eat Paxillus. They're beautiful mushrooms though, and they have really cool, like there's a pigment in them, or a polyphenol that deters insects from eating them. That's why they stain brown. Jack-o'-lantern mushrooms, Omphallotus. This is a huge cluster actually found on that day with Michael that we were out in Sonoma, and these can make you very sick. You can also dye fabric with them, and the West Coast species glows in the dark, which is pretty cool. False morels, I hate the name false morel. I would rather call them lorchells. Some people call them different things, but these are Gyromitra. These contain a monomethyl hydrazine. They can make you very sick. It's a central nervous toxin. And Satan's bolete, which is the only like really toxic bolete you have to worry about. All other boletes are pretty much safe to eat, and Satan's is going to have a lot of reticulation on the stem and red pores and stained blue. And this is bolestane, which is a protein that even it's heat stable, so even if you cook it, it'll still make you sick. And this can kill people. It's rare, but Satan's bolete is deadly.
Hey, Gordon.
Yeah.
The Phalloides and the Gallerina are both, they both have it here.
Yeah. So you got them here? Yeah. I assume you have some version of the Destroying Angel out here. It's just probably not Ocreata.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if it's...
The death cap was found in Aurora like 2 years ago in somebody's backyard.
Yeah, it's spreading. It's displacing native species and spreading. There was a really interesting paper recently about it. Like, it doesn't need to find a compatible mating partner. It can kind of just like hybridize with itself and keep going. So that's part of why it's spreading so invasively.
Can I say something else about those two, the Destroying Angel and the Death Cap?
Shoot.
So apparently when you do eat them and get poisoned by it, you go through like a really horrific, like 20...
You're initially very, very sick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're very, very sick. You're puking, you're vomiting, you're feeling terrible. And then you feel like you're getting better.
Yep, but you're not.
Yeah, so a couple days you'd be like, oh my gosh, I'm
better.
Now. But it's slowly and silently killing you, and then about a little over a week later you just die.
Yeah, it's because it's at that point all of your organs are starting to shut down. You get over the initial sickness, and then all of your organs are shut. There's a few emerging treatments that maybe they can sort of salvage some of the enzyme. It's RNA polymerase II in your liver, but it's just don't eat these. There's not a good way to deal with this. Just don't eat them. Again, Muscaria gets the rap as people are like, it's so toxic. And you're like, actually, this mushroom's really not very toxic. These, however, are very toxic. What I want to point out to you guys, are any of these other than Muscaria very colorful? They're kind of drab, right? People associate color with toxicity. And I think that's hilarious because in mushrooms, color is not related to toxicity at all. Unlike animals and plants, the color of mushrooms often has nothing to do with its edibility. The top four of these are all from New Zealand, and some of the most incredible colored mushrooms I've seen. They're from my friend Lee Ormsby. She lives there, and I just live vicariously through her content because she has these incredible blue antilomas. This is the national mushroom of New Zealand, but these beautiful little red mycenas, the red bonnets, the beautiful green wax caps, hygroscopy, this weird sort of sequoioid pouch purple Cortinarius that actually apparently this thing mimics purple fruit because there used to be these huge cassowary birds in New Zealand would go around and eat the fruit of stuff that looked like this, and this mushroom evolved to look like that fruit so that birds would eat it and poop it out in different places. We have Romaria, which the red one's edible. These other two probably give you the shits, but the red one's edible. This Lactarius, which this is the one that turns bright orange and has the orange latex, but as a tiny little nascent button, it's green. This is edible, pretty good. Beautiful waxy cap here from New Hampshire. And this is actually one of the rare mushrooms that was on the fundus rare mushroom thing, this Neo albatrellus, the little blue polypore. I don't know if you could eat this or not, but I wouldn't because it's pretty rare, but cool to find it. We have UV and UV reactive and bioluminescent mushrooms. So UV reactive are fluorescent mushrooms. You shine a UV light on them. Brian and I were doing this last night. I brought home some Foliota and we were shining lights on it and taking photos of it. Had a grand old time. These mushrooms do not make their own light. but if you shine UV light on them, there's compounds in the mushroom that get excited. Those electrons go up in energy state, and as they go back down in energy state, they emit light at a different wavelength. And that's what we see as fluorescence. So I'm shining a light on this, and it's shooting out light at a different wavelength, and that's what we're capturing. This Leptonia is one of the most just absolutely like stunning Leptonia carnea, incredible blue color. These hemimycena were really beautiful. You know, the sulfur tufts, these hyphaloma are pretty common. You'll see those all over the place. Bioluminescent mushrooms are different. They actually produce their own light. Granted, it's not a very strong light. You often need to do like a long exposure to actually capture it. But the Omphaliotis olivascens, the jack-o'-lantern mushroom I mentioned, actually you can see with the naked eye. My friend Damon did a photo, and this is the jack-o'-lantern there. There's Pinella stypticus, which apparently like way back in the day when they were first inventing submarines, they were thinking about trying to like use Pinella stypticus as a light source because it was bright enough. But a lot of them are sort of little, they're all wood decay fungi, and they're all in the same family as like jack-o'-lanterns and honey mushrooms and mycena, and they're all in one family. And they're using an enzyme very similar to the way that like jellyfish glow in the dark. They're luciferin, luciferase, but they're generating their own chemical energy to make light versus being, you know, spurred on by fluorescence. Fluorescence happens in a lot of different mushrooms, whereas the bioluminescence only happens in a small portion of mushrooms.
Is there any idea what this does for them?
Well, the fluorescence, we don't have any real clue to that. It's just kind of an interesting phenomenon. And bioluminescence, it's been hypothesized that it helps attract insects, but when they've done animal studies to actually see if insects are going towards bioluminescence, they don't. So it's a theory, but it hasn't been proven. Doesn't mean it's not right, it just means that we don't have any proof for it yet. It could also just be a complete byproduct. Who knows? I'm not sure. So here's some cool mushroom aromas. I always encourage people to smell mushrooms when they're picking them. Candy cap, Michael talked about, is one that smells like maple. It's got this incredible molecule called sodalon. It's the same compound that's in maple syrup and sherry and fenugreek spice. All smell like maple because they have sodalon. The Prince almond scented agaric. I know you guys have some similar species out here. Matsutake, sort of weird cinnamon, seafood, funky foot gym sock smell kind of thing. Bluets, which to me smell like frozen orange juice concentrate. If you've ever had orange juice from a cafeteria, you know what a bluet smells like. Cedar waxycaps, these things smell like very like terpenic and cedary, and the Russian leather is the descriptor they use. I don't know if anyone knows what that actually is, but it has this really cool perfumey smell. This anise smell too, which you often see along with the almond smell. Oysters have a little bit of this kind of like seafoody anise. There's somewhere in between like one of these and a matsutake. There's some things that just really stink, like the stinky squid. This is a horrible smelling stinkhorn. One of the worst smelling mushrooms I've smelled. Like a tiny one on the ground. Like, God, like what is there? A dead body who farted? Like someone took a shit. What is going on? It's these things. They smell awful, but I love them. They're super cool looking. And then these yellow staining agarics that smell like phenol. You think like scotch, disinfectant, medicinal, library paste, all sorts of weird stuff. Avoid those. These will make you sick if you eat them. And then there's just this incredible, like, getting up close on a mushroom, get a macro lens, get in there. Brian, my buddy, took this photo of like the underside of this Swillus pungescens and this incredible like guttation and droplets and gooiness that's all over the place. This is a hygroscopic earth star. This is a puffball. This is old man of the woods, Strabillomyces. This is some like nascent young Sterium, pores of a Xerocamelus bolete. The reticulation on this frost bolete, this bright red, blue staining bolete that should look toxic, but it's actually edible and tastes like lemon. Then like, gooey, cool jelly fungi. I just am blown away every time I get up close to a mushroom. Like, wow, even the most boring mushroom has cool stuff if you look close enough. And then, of course, my absolute favorite phenomenon in mushrooms, which is guttation. And this is basically mushroom sweat. Mushrooms growing fast produce a lot of CO2 and water, and it manifests as droplets on the surface of a mushroom. And the color often comes from like polyphenols that are in the mushroom itself. So the really famous one is Hydellum pecii, but all these Hydellum have different colored guttation, and there's lots of different. This is the base of a Swillus with the yellow one. This is Maitake. I added some UV light to make the guttation look more interesting, but this is, we found this yesterday, the rosy conch, Postea, Sterium, just guttation is so cool because it means that things are growing really fast. And then another one of my favorite fungal associates are these microheterotrophic plants. These are plants that have completely lost the ability to do photosynthesis. They have no green part, and they live as a little like rhizome, kind of like a chunk of ginger underground. And once a year, they produce these brilliant colored flowers that come up as a big cluster. It's called an inflorescence. But they look absolutely otherworldly, alien-like, and they are completely dependent on being tapped into the mycorrhizal network and drawing all their carbon and sugar out from the mycelium in the ground. And there's one sugar stick, which kind of looks like a giant candy cane, is actually associated with Matsutake. So if you ever see sugar stick, you know you're in Matsutake habitat. A lot of these other ones associate with like Russula and a few other different species. And orchids, of course, will never produce an actual plant unless there's a fungus there for them to kind of draw nutrients out of. Orchid seeds have like no nutrients in them. Instead, they attract fungi and then kind of hijack the nutrients from the fungi to then form orchids. So also really cool. Slime molds are not fungi, but they are really cool. They are sort of amoeba protist-like things, and they crawl around and form weird-looking plasmodium, and then eventually form little distinct sporangia, the spore-bearing things. And there's a few different like versions of what the sporangia look like. They're like insect egg slime mold, that hamia, the wolf's milk slime mold, which means little like pimple-like things you can pop, trachea, and all these different wild-looking things. Here's an example of some like slime mold moving around, just like pulsing. You'll see more stuff like this on my TikTok, and each one of these took me probably like 60 to 80 minutes to record. So flashing through it like this is, just hours worth of work and footage. And you're like, oh, that's cool. But, that's what you're seeing is what's called cytoplasmic streaming, as this like bidirectional flow of stuff goes across the plasmodium as it's developing. That's pretty cool. Oops. Okay. And then I'll just end with one sort of like big picture, like here's all the things we can do with fungi. So there's this idea of like a mushroom-based circular economy. Can we start out with like waste products from forestry, from agriculture, and we're able to use them to grow mushrooms, to produce food, to make medicines and drugs, to make mycomaterials, make mycoproteins. We have all that spent substrate, and we can put that back into like mycoremediation. We can create compost and food and energy and biochar. But for all this stuff to work, there has to be a fair amount of like learning and design and like selection and building and testing, and there's a lot of stuff that goes into this. So there's still a lot of science and work that needs to be done. It's not just a big hunky-dory thing that we've already figured out. But that being said, mushrooms are incredibly sustainable. On 1 acre of land, you grow like 1 million pounds of mushrooms. Mushrooms are incredibly water efficient. You take something like 12 to 15 gallons of water to produce a pound of mushroom, where it takes like 1,600 gallons worth to produce a pound of beef. So think about the differential there in terms of protein. Even most crops require 400 gallons per pound of like some for soybeans, something like that. So mushrooms are incredibly sustainable, and I'm not going to say they're going to save the world, because the world is already a fungal world, and we're just living in it. So anyhow, thank you guys for listening. If you got more questions for me, you can check out all my various social media things. I have a podcast where I kind of jump through a lot of these topics, and it's on all the platforms. I got a website. I get some cool merch on there. If you really want to hear more from me, I do like Patreon and can be a cooking advice, or you can just email me. I'm a normal human being. I'm not very good at email, but I'll check it eventually.
Not normal. You're a human being.
Kind of a weird human. Yeah. I'll buy that.
I would say, are we?
Well, has anyone here watched Last of Us?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is anyone afraid of becoming a zombie?
No.
Do you still want to hear me debunk Last of Us?
Yes.
Okay, I got one more. So these are entomopathogens. These are the fungi that infect insects. Not all of them form mushrooms. Many of them are zygos, so they don't make mushrooms. And there's a bunch of different ones that do different things. And this is kind of a cool little flow chart to figure out, like, is the active host. And some of these are like, some of them are generalists, some of them are very specific. Most cordyceps tend to be very specific, but like there's the asexual anamorphic versus the sexual teleomorphic form. And sometimes they will switch from like hosts. In like the anamorphic form, they'll infect things generally as a mold, and then the cordyceps form, they'll be very specific to like one insect, which is a really interesting like trade-off. They can be both forms, and for a long time people didn't recognize that anamorphs and telomorphs were the same thing until we started doing DNA sequencing. And there's all sorts of weird stuff that happens with entomopathogens, and we're exploring a lot of them actually use as biocontrols. So instead of just spraying broad spectrum pesticides, maybe we can specifically bring certain like entomopathogenic fungi into a field and make them become part of the ecosystem in that field that will help not kill all of the insects, but take down, like, let's say like 40 to 60% reduction in the pest. Suddenly you get a lot more crops and you're not spraying pesticides, and you keep all the other healthy insects and microbiome going on, which means the whole ecosystem as a whole benefits. Anyhow, so those are entomopathogenic fungi, but this is the sort of the rub of Last of Us, right? They said that a cordyceps jumped the species barrier and suddenly infected humans, and within like a week we all became zombies. I don't know quite how that happens because fungi grow pretty slowly, but let's look at it. So increasing global temperatures will lead to more serious pathogenic fungal infections. That's true, and actually human body temperatures are dropping. So as the world's temperature generally goes up, fungi become more able to grow at higher temperatures, and that makes them better at infecting us. So we will see an increase in the number of serious pathogenic fungal infections. However, most fungal pathogenic infections manifest as rashes, lung infections, or like GI infections, and like in your gut. They do none of those turn you into a zombie. Some of them can kill you, but they're still not going to turn you into a zombie. Fungi can infect and manipulate their hosts by producing both psychoactive compounds or repressing the immune system. So there's a crazy fungus called Massospora. It's a zygo, and it turns the butts of cicadas into this giant mass of spores. And it pumps their brains full of either like a methamphetamine type thing or psilocybin, and makes them go crazy and dance around and act like they're mating. And then other cicadas come up and dance around with a big like fungal load on their butt, and they get infected too. So that's pretty wild. There's another thing called Tolipocladium, which infects scarab beetles, but also infects like deer truffles and creates these cordyceps-looking things. And that has a compound called cyclosporin, which can repress immune system and is actually the #1 drug that we use for organ transplants. People who have organ transplants have to take cyclosporin every day to suppress their immune system, and they don't die by rejecting their organ. Fungi are equipped, so that is true, but it's, in a limited context. It can control like a cicada. Controlling a human is a little bit more complicated. Fungi are equipped with bioactive compounds that can help them resist microbes and rot. So yeah, penicillin is produced. It's a fungi makes an antibacterial. Boom, helps them with competition. So that is true. Fungi cannot survive the host's internal temperatures over 94 degrees. That is patently false. We're full of fungi that live just fine over 94 degrees. That's our human body temperature. It is falling, but this is one of the things that I think was a big part of like the game and was part of the show, and it's just there's not truth to that. We have no drugs to fight fungal infections. That is false. We have azoles. They're fairly effective antifungals. Problem is, azoles are also very toxic to us, and compared to antibacterials, we do not have very many antifungal drugs. And so once we get fungal species like Candida auris is one that's spreading all over the place in hospitals. It is resistant to azoles and the other antifungal control measures we have, so it is causing some pretty serious like infections in hospitals. And then a show, fungi evolve quickly, are extremely pathogenic, and infections spread via contact with blood. None of that's true. Fungi spread by spore. They're pretty slow. They're persistent, so it can take a long time for fungal infection to get established, but then it can take potentially months to years to get rid of. And anyone who has had like a toenail infection or any other like skin fungal infection knows it takes a while. So I'm not worried about a fungal zombie apocalypse, but I am concerned about the rising number of fungal mycoses and pathogenic fungi that could be out there. And it's a thing that we should keep in mind. It's also a great reason to consider possibly taking medicinal mushrooms or supplements, because they will help stimulate your immune system and you can help resist some of those diseases that are out there. So with that, I'll hand it over to Shane.
Cool, thank you. Thanks, guys. We're going to take a few minutes so people can stretch their legs. Shane can get set up. We'll come back. We'll do the slides. Use the restroom. Buy a nice drink for my friend Ramsey. Tell me how cute I look. Whatever you guys.
Oh, he's so cute. Look at him.
Cute.
So cute, Michael. All right, bye YouTube.